is it moving? The voice, is it causing movement in the machines? Okay, so Giorgione, Titian, Venice, and the High Renaissance. So, a few words by way of introduction to our subject. Giorgione alone could use a full semester class. Titian could use several years easily. Um, Venice is a gigantic subject. So, at best, we are being very compressed in the coverage of the material and therefore have to be extremely selective. And clearly, those of you who've been following my talks hopefully have noticed a pattern. And so I will be a little bit more explicit about that pattern. So, just under 2,500 years ago, Aristotle observed that when we ask the question why, we're not asking one question, why is something the way it is, but we're asking several questions, and he pared it down to four. And in the Middle Ages, this was formulated as the four causes, and essentially um, the formal cause, the efficient cause, the material cause, and the final cause. And we, and basically the way I present the material is, first of all, since you are artists and actually as human beings, the world is first and foremost presented to our sight through our eyes. So we observe patterns. And when we look at paintings, paintings don't stand alone. They stand in relation to earlier paintings and later paintings. So that's one of the patterns that I focus on. And the patterns as presented to our eyes as patterns is essentially the formal cause. The formal cause is the thing in its own terms as an entity presented to vision. The final cause, of course, is the answer to the question, what is it for? The material cause is essentially what is it made of? What does it come from in terms of stuff? The efficient cause is the cause of motion or change. So we oscillate largely between the final cause, which is implicit, and the formal cause, which, if you tease it out sufficiently, always points to a final cause. Okay, not to be too mysterious. Venice, St. Mark, the lion. It is really only in the 15th and 16th century that Venice truly becomes self-conscious of itself, and its self-consciousness begins to be represented fully through the visual realm, which is to say through its art and principally its painting. And it's when Venice becomes preeminent in painting and one of the major centers of the art of painting in Europe. So here we get a glimpse of the center of the city, the three principal landmarks, the Church of St. Mark, the church tower, the Campanile, and the Doge's Palace. And if you don't know it, you should remember this, that St. Mark's, although it's called a cathedral, it's really the Doge's private chapel, in which, and also the place where the relics of St. Mark's are venerated. The second image shows the fundamental engine of Venice and its reason for being what it is. In other words, its command of the seas. And by the way, that tower over there represents the actual Cathedral of Venice is on a separate island just beyond the arsenal. Okay, one of these frightening maps. Okay, the red shows the Venetian possessions at their height at the beginning of the 16th century. And in relation to this purple mass is the ever expanding and will be expanding for the next 2 centuries Ottoman Empire, which will eventually take over 2/3 of the Mediterranean and gobble up the whole of Hungary in a couple of decades, actually. This blotchy area, the Holy Roman Empire, with an emperor now residing in Vienna mostly, but not exclusively. This is the realm of France, about just exiting out of the Hundred Years' War, and Little England, which will soon master the seas. Now, this map shows Venice at the height of its land acquisitions around just before 1509. Now, this is contemporary with the end of the work we were looking at last week, the artistic trajectory of Giovanni Bellini. And I left out most of the exciting stories associated with his times, but the beginning of the 16th century gets even more exciting, and it's represented by this list. Now, if you look at this list carefully, these are the periods of warfare in central and northern Italy. So, 1494 to 98. There's hardly a gap between the First Italian War and the Second Italian War, which then goes from 1499 to 1504. Just 3 years or 4 between 1508 and 1516, and this is the end of, the brief few decades of the life of Giorgione as an artist, and the youth and early maturity of Titian. And around 1509, 1510, Venice is almost snuffed out of the map. Venice almost loses everything, including itself. It barely recovers. It recovers partially. It holds on to eventually most of its land territory, but at a price. Then there's a little bit of a stretch between 1516 and 1521. Another long, intense war, the Italian War of 1521-26. It ends with the sack of Rome and the disaster and what is officially considered the end of the High Renaissance. Well, that's just not really a pause. 1526 to 30, another war. Remember, this is also the lifetime of Michelangelo. 36 to 38, another war, another brief pause. 42 to 46, another war. 51 to 59. So most of that century is warfare, and you can hardly call it peace when you have a year or two, or mostly 3, between wars. Okay, at the beginning of our century, these are the major players. The much maligned, and unfairly so, and some people consider him, in fact, to have been a great pope, Pope Alexander VI Borgia. His rather energetic son, who executed his father's vision and strategies. And the fundamental goal of the Borgia Pope was to introduce peace and order in the realm that was then called the Patrimony of St. Peter, or the Papal State. And when the popes were weak, all the neighbors and all the local strongmen would exercise their desire to rule and take over. So only a strong hand at the center could keep peace and good order. So that's what the Borgia Pope tried to do. The stories, I'll say a little bit about the stories associated with him in a moment. This is his lovely daughter, possibly the only contemporary portrait of her, the famous Lucretia Borgia, who was not a poisoner. Ignore all those stories. She was a lovely, genteel lady, as you can see from this picture. And she gave birth to a son who ultimately gave us the Villa d'Este, one of the great glories of garden design in the 16th century. This is a romantic view from the early 19th century. And this is the engraving by Dupeyrac, from contemporary with the final design by Piero Ligorio for the gardens, which shows the full intention in a single image of the gardens. So back to our beginnings. Titian was probably born around somewhere between 1488 and 1490. So he was a child in 1494 at the beginning of all these very difficult and exciting times. Giorgione was a little older. He wouldn't live as long. Titian lived well into his 80s, perhaps his early 90s. It's not really known. There are no records for his actual birth date, and he himself didn't know. So, the key war, the War of the League of Cambrai, is the war which is going on and which will come very close to bring an end to Venice just at the beginning of the climax of Bellini's career and the full career of Giorgione and the emerging career of Titian. Now, another one of the players, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, as painted by Dürer, a rather serious man, very jealous of his prerogatives, and very much in competition with this man, the King of France, Louis XII, very jealous of his prerogatives, and each one of them sees themselves as the true heir of Charlemagne, and so therefore the perpetual ultimate warfare, jockeying for power. And then you have something happened. And then you have this man, of course, the new Pope, who replaced the Borgia reign with a very short interregnum, Pope Julius II. It's Pope Julius II who gives us the Borgia legend. He detested the Borgias, because they were Spanish, and the Italians hated the Spanish for the principal reason that the Spanish had become the major European power thanks to their affairs and the wealth that they were gaining from their new colonies in Central and South America, and their desire to take over both north and southern Italy, namely Milan and Naples. So they were the natural enemies of the popes, and personally, because the Borgia Pope meant that he didn't become Pope 20 years earlier. So he was an old man and a sickly man, but a very energetic man. And what he did to make sure that the Borgia story was really lurid is he had the Borgia servants put under torture. And of course, they said anything he wanted them to say. And so the stories of all the murders and poisonings and all that largely he's the origin of these stories. And the great Doge, Pope Leonardo Loredan, who was the Pope who presided both over the hubris and the fall and the eventual recovery of the Venetian Empire. And this is Giovanni Bellini's great portrait of him. Giovanni Bellini, at this point, at the height of his powers. Notice the ledge, which is very characteristic of Bellini's later work, and the little piece of paper with his signature and the name of the painting. Bellini had an older brother, and he's responsible for this next set of paintings. And these are paintings of particular events, actually miracles in the life of the city of Venice, but the point is that they're also a representation of the city of Venice. In other words, Venice becoming self-conscious of itself as a unique entity, and its very appearance being a part of its story. And a close-up here. This miracle is said to have occurred in relation to a building which was basically the German Emporium, i.e. the German Economic Embassy in Venice. So the miracle is happening on this portico. And these facades were painted by, it was one of these buildings with, which was stuccoed and then frescoed. And the two principal painters were Giorgione and the young Titian. Most of these frescoes have vanished, sadly. Another of Bellini's paintings, The Miracle of the Cross at the Bridge of San Lorenzo. Again, there's a story here, but a big part of the story is Venice itself. And this is a tradition which, of course, will culminate in the great works of urban painting at the end of the 17th and through the 18th century. In other words, Canaletto, Bellotto, and their contemporaries. So, and finally, again, Bellini's older brother, The Procession of the Cross from 1496, and The Miracle of the Cross. The Miracle of the Cross is just here in the painting, this man who is kneeling as the cross passes in the procession, praying for the recovery of his son, who is miraculously cured. And clearly, it's not just about that. It's about the glory of Venice. And this is a map which was published in the year 1500, one of the first bird's eye representations of a city. Clearly imagined, because there were no balloons, not to mention any other way of getting this view, but a powerful image of Venice at its height, attempting to grab a land empire in the interregnum between popes. Okay. This painting you can all visit. It's in Washington, D.C. It's Bellini's final painting. It was left partially unfinished, actually probably largely finished, but then completed by two of Bellini's followers and former students, a fellow by the name of Dossio and Titian. And what it represents is the Feast of the Gods, a very different kind of subject in painting from the images of Bellini's work that we looked at last time. And just some close-ups. So here you see examples of Oriental ceramics as a part of very anachronistically of the painting. This enigmatic landscape which looms over this vision, and here you have a barrel in the corner with Bellini's characteristic signature and title on a piece of parchment. So, what happened to this painting? Well, this painting was a part of a set. I don't know how many of you have visited the amazing wooden paneled with essentially paintings in wooden inlaid studiolo at the Met. But these are paintings for an equivalent room, another studiolo. This was just the first of a series of paintings that the patron commissioned. He asked Raphael and Michelangelo to contribute paintings, but Raphael had very few years left to live, and Michelangelo was quite uninterested. So it was left to Bellini and ultimately Titian to furnish the paintings for this room. And the client was interested in these stories coming out of the pagan corpus, mostly as embodied in Ovid. So, this is one of the earliest representations of the pagan gods as a high Renaissance subject, and here we have it in its room at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., very nicely framed and foregrounded because it's one of their treasures. So the client wasn't entirely happy with what Bellini gave him. So in the original painting, this forest extended over the whole of the painting. He thought the leaves weren't green enough, and he was very happy with the foreground. But so what happened was Dossio, who was the person who first took over the painting after Bellini died, he introduced ruins in this area of the painting, ancient Roman ruins, and he made the trees a little greener. And the painting has been carefully studied, the pigments and through x-rays, etc., when it was recently restored, so these interventions are a little clearer. Well, the client wasn't entirely happy with Dossio's interventions either, and so Titian took over when he took over the entire project for the Studiolo, and so this landscape is actually Titian's part of the painting, and this bird was actually painted by the patron, and it's very crudely painted, and as you can see, it dominates this part of the painting. But it's the emblem of his family, and so the painting was Alfonso d'Este, of the same family that Lucretia married into and gave heirs to that dynasty. So we're going to briefly look at a number of Titian's paintings that were a part of the set. Not all the paintings for that set survive. Titian's contribution is this Bacchus and Ariadne, which comes out of Ovid. Ariadne is about to be turned by Bacchus into this constellation up here, and so it's capturing that moment. Bacchus is, of course, Dionysus, and here you see his leopard chariot and his entourage of very dangerous people or forces. A spectacular painting, one of Titian's early masterpieces, there's no question about it. And if we study it in the context of the late work of Bellini and Giorgione's work, you can see that he's operating and making his own personal contribution to a very distinct style. So discernment style is very much our business as we look at these paintings. These are reasonable reproductions. The Bacchanal of the Andrians, the island of Andros, is another one of Titian's paintings contemporary with this set. I was going to ask formally those of you who attended my class in the fall, even you should also, but certainly those who didn't, listen to lecture number 3 as well as lecture number 9, which will lay out the larger argument for what I'm about to say here. In other words, spatially, what's happening with these figures and this landscape? Does this landscape have any true perspectival depth? Some of you have seen the Thomas Cole exhibition. You're familiar with 19th and early 20th century paintings. If we just look at it casually, it clearly is high Renaissance, but a closer examination shows that the historia, as Alberti calls it, the story, the narrative, is foregrounded in the painting. And even the space between the figures is extremely compressed. And the background looks very much like a painted stage flat, right? It has the illusionary depth is only apparent, even though we can imaginatively create greater depth than is represented in any geometric way. And even this painting, which has clearly a recession, the figures get smaller as they go towards the center, nonetheless exists in extremely compressed space. This is called the Worship of Venus. There you see her, Venus, and her worshippers are a bunch of baby putti. Very related to a drawing by Michelangelo, which you saw in the Michelangelo show last fall. And this is where several of these paintings reside today in the Prado. I like to show the context for paintings, even when it's not the original context, in this very strange pink room with silver ornament. Okay, so while Titian was painting his first masterpieces, the preeminent artist in Venice after Bellini's death was in fact one of his students coming out of his atelier, Giorgione. And so now we're going to look at a number of Giorgione's surviving works. There are very few works which can be, through documentation, directly attributed to him. So many of the works are now attributed to him stylistically and more circumstantially. But this is a work which is confidently attributed to him. It's the Madonna and Child between St. Francis and St. Neascus, painted around 1503, 1504. So while Bellini was painting his final masterpieces, the young Giorgione, who, by the way, died in 1510 at the age of 33. So these are paintings from his 20s. I guess, yeah, so the young Giorgione, who would die in 1510 at the age of 33. So he's in his early 20s right here, painting his first recognized masterpiece. But what do you notice about it? It's not exactly in the Titian compressed spatial style, right? The foreground is an attempt to create figures existing in a close to authentic geometric space. And in doing this, he's very much working against the great works of his master Bellini, all of whose great spatial compositions are in compressed space. And you see what happens. He's forced to push you up to a very high viewpoint because he wants to have a unitary viewpoint. The Madonna, to be important, has to sit on this immense, very artificial pedestal throne. And even so, she is pushed into the middle ground, and the saints are foregrounded, except that all of them are in the middle ground because he wants to show the space. And so you have way too much floor that becomes a dominant part of his painting. So, unquestionably, the figures are spectacular. His command of color is spectacular. His command of composition is extraordinary. This stylized landscape in the background is very haunting. The draperies are amazing, but the composition is very much in the trajectory of these 15th century paintings which try to show perspectival realism and suffer the inevitable consequences. That was my lecture number 3, which in the Michelangelo series, where I laid all that out in some detail. Here is where the painting exists in its context. At least it's a part of a church, although this is not likely to be its original frame, and it was always designed to be a altar painting. Here's a close-up of the Madonna. She's in mood and character, very close to Bellini's, although the focus on the rich draperies and carpets are more characteristic of Giorgione. but very well done. And just to show the difference, here we have one of Bellini's final masterpieces, the altar painting in St. Zachary's. And just to show you the contrast and seeing it in its frame. So, a young artist spreading his wings, and a mature master who had the good fortune to live into his 80s and still be vital and pushing the limits of his genius even well into his old age. Another early masterpiece of Giorgione's. This is just a few years later, 1505, The Adoration of the Shepherds. Here the master is much more complete. He's given up on this perspectival realism, and although it is kind of a stage set, it's also a vision of an idealized world. And the focus are the two figures in the center. Those are the shepherds. And in terms of compositional complexities, this is well worth your study. There are many diagonals, ovals, spirals, just the way your eye glides over and is ultimately brought to the ultimate focus here is it's an extraordinary tour de force. And his most famous painting, of which I couldn't find one decent color reproduction online, so I'm going to show you a couple, is the famous Tempest. The subject matter of this painting has caused literally tens of thousands of pages of print, and it remains a mystery. What you can say is that it's an allegory of some sort. And even the nature of the allegory is severely undermined. Here you see it at its current setting. It's in the Accademia in Florence. It's not a huge painting. This was the best image I found of its frame. But a recent careful study of the painting with x-rays has discovered that originally he had another female figure in this lower left-hand side. So today, the standard way of reading this is it's the shepherd and the gypsy, or the soldier and the gypsy. We're not going to go into this allegory. There are many challenges with this painting. If you look very closely at this lady with her child, she actually has only one breast, which is probably intentional. It's hard to imagine that he would have overlooked that, since he was certainly a master of the human figure as well as landscape. So I returned you to this image, which is a more perfect artistic realization, and then another one of his reasonably securely attributed paintings. It's called The Three Philosophers. Again, a big mystery. Many hypotheses. This gentleman with his carpenter's square and his dividers clearly is a part of the narrative, but many stories can be projected onto it. I didn't get any pictures of its current setting, but here you see it as a painting among many paintings from the late 17th century, and when it was in Brussels, and then just another reproduction of it where you get a better sense of they're not really that black. He is looking into a cave. There's no doubt about it. These two other people are looking in various other directions. None of them are engaged in a conversation with each other. And then another one of the works that has been attributed both to Giorgione and to Titian, but is likely to have been a painting that Giorgione was working on when he died, and that very possibly Titian finished, is the musicians. You have again two enigmatic ladies, actually, and this one is playing a flute with two other musicians. A figure in the far distance, a villa on the landscape, another allegory. There was the Age of Allegory. Actually, the Age of Allegory only ended in the 19th century, pretty much. And one of his most famous paintings, The Sleeping Venus, which was very likely finished by Titian, but unfortunately, other hands took over. And where you can see what the other hands did is they massacred the composition because the putti was painted out probably in the 19th century. So you have Venus and you have her agent in the world, Eros. Now, reclining nude figures are very much a part of the ancient tradition. This is a surviving fresco from Pompeii, which is somewhat cartoonish replica of what was probably a well-known ancient painting of the birth of Venus in her shell. Of course, the most famous image of the birth of Venus in our tradition is Botticelli's famous painting in the Uffizi. But this is the first post-antique reclining nude figure in the Western tradition, and there will be innumerably more. So Giorgione was clearly exploring new iconographic realms in the first decade of the 16th century, and this is Titian 30 years later, and our trajectory will end in the 1530s when we look at Titian's work. So this is a transformation. Important to see what is kept, what is changed. Apparently, the occasion of the painting was a patron getting married, and so the image of the painting has something to do with fertility and the hope for children, heirs. Now, this needs to be said. Who was the really big guy on the block in the first and second decades of the 15th century and really throughout the center of the 15th century, 16th century rather? Of course, it was Michelangelo. And between 1508 and 1512, he was painting the Sistine ceiling. So, how was his influence? I mean, what was the agent of change, as it were, in terms of his influence? Well, of course, you'd have to actually see him at work and see the ceiling. But already in the 16th century, the art of engraving was developing in leaps and bounds. And contemporary with Michelangelo are a series of engravings of parts of his work. So this is how his work was largely known through Europe, through engravings. This is a slightly later engraving from about 1577, but there are engravings that are earlier and are contemporary with Michelangelo being alive as well. So this is how Titian would have first known of Michelangelo's work, because otherwise he was pretty much tied to Venice. So, early Titian, an altarpiece in a magnificent altar frame. St. Mark enthroned among the saints. This is from 1508, 1509. And here's a close-up. As you can see, it's much closer to Giorgione in terms of placing figures in more natural perspectival space than it is to the compressed space of Bellini. And you come with the same problems, right? Because it's a single viewpoint, Mark is up there being foreshortened and receding back as we look up at him. He looks like he's about to tip over in that direction. There's this elaborate fabric that is covering the pedestal throne. You don't see much of the throne, so he looks extremely precarious in his perch. So, to be sure, the painting is brilliant, the details are brilliant, the composition is challenging, but not exactly mature. Here's another painting from that period where he is much more directly channeling Bellini, but again, trying to place figures in actual space in relation to each other. And again, although beautifully painted, see how the fact that she's sitting in the same room as them and is sitting lower than them, he tips the perspective, and his command of the composition is brilliant. But there's an excessive realism operating, which he will shortly overcome. A more iconic image in the tradition of Bellini from around 1510, 1511, the so-called Gypsy Madonna. In many of these paintings, again, not just in Bellini's, but in contemporaries, you can see that part of the background is actually a fabric. Titian elaborates the fabric in beautiful detail. So, okay. We need to speed up a little. Okay, so another contemporary painting from 1510. So, what has happened? Like Giorgione, he has given up this attempt for perspectival realism and is back in the realm of compressed space, where the entirety of the narrative, the historia, is pushed towards the picture plane, and even the space behind them is again a kind of compressed stage set, albeit brilliant, beautiful, truly a stunning composition. Remember, this is contemporary with the last decade of Raphael's life and his famous pyramidal compositions. Um, this is between 1512 and 1516. Um, Hard to find good reproductions of this one because it tends towards virtually black, as you can see here and here. So I don't know what the actual colors are. This was the best reproduction I could find. And then again, contemporary with these, this another mysterious painting. These three figures. One of them playing a keyboard. Another one with a early version of the violin. It's called the interrupted performance or concert by some people, or just the concert. A somewhat better reproduction in some ways, but not in others. The painting is extremely worn at both ends, and these faces are pretty much just the underpainting. The best preserved part of the painting is right in the center. But there is a difference that we're noticing very clear between the stylized visages of Bellini, the idealized visages of Bellini, and of Giorgione. And with Titian, you can imagine that these are real people that you, in somewhat exalted circles, might meet. And another one of the more obvious allegories by Titian, this is from around 1512, 1514, The Three Ages of Man. This one is more straightforward. There you have a Cupid with a bunch of babies that he's playing with. In the distance, you have an old man facing his mortality, and you have an oblivious youth in the left-hand side of the painting. But also study it in terms of composition. It's quite brilliant. And then a series of portraits from this period. This is from 1510, now in the National Gallery in London. It's just called the Portrait of a Man. We don't know who it is. But notice it is very much in Bellini's tradition, the parapet, although without the label, the abstracted ground, and the focus on the figure. Just to remind you, Bellini, his late masterpiece of the Doge who commanded the first decade of the 16th century. And now we're in new territory. There's the hint of the parapet here. This almost begins to look like early Rembrandt when it's, as it were, underexposed. And another painting that I had a hard time finding a decent reproduction of. It's called The Woman with a Mirror, because that's all we know is there's this lady, there's this mirror, there's a fellow whispering in her ear. But an extraordinary painting. This one either is Salome with the head of John the Baptist or Judith with the head of Holofernes. And it's believed that this is a self-portrait of Titian at this age. If it is, he's channeling Michelangelo, having done the same thing in the Sistine ceiling. It's more likely to be Judith because it's hard to explain this figure if it's Salome with John the Baptist. And one of his most famous paintings called Sacred and Profane Love in the Galleria Borghese in Rome from 1515, 1516. So he is the dominant painter now. Giorgione died in 1510. Bellini has passed away as well. And so this is very much one of the paintings which will secure his fame. Notice still how stylized the landscape is and how completely the figures dominate the foreground, and even their relationship to each other and to their props, as it were, exist in compressed space. But the fully... Okay, so Titian is famous for a extremely saturated palette, right? However, not as much as you might think. If you look at great stretches of the painting, they're in half color and even in quarter color. It's only the major figures, and there's a real spectrum of how the color dominates the picture field. And then we arrive at the painting that secured his fame for all time, the Assumption in the Church of the Franciscans, Santa Maria Gloriosa of the Friars in Venice, the high altar of the church. There you see in its setting. The setting exists in its original setting. The frame is the original frame. Of course, it was designed for the entirety of its setting. See how it's framed by the choir, which stands in front of it and is partially enclosed. So you see you have that frame, you have that frame, you have that frame, you have the frame of the church. And when you step back, you see how it dominates the church. It's a huge painting. Well, it almost ended up elsewhere when the French arrived and did their rearrangement of the polity and all that. It was moved to the Academy. This room, the ceiling was raised so that it could fit in the room. So this gives you a sense of its actual size. But fortunately, it was returned. So, context, artistic context. This is Bellini, one of his last paintings, 1510 to 1515, The Virgin in Glory with Saints. Just to set the framework into which Titian is introducing his new personality. And this is Palma Vecchio, his painting of the same subject. Of course, contemporary, exactly to contemporary with the Titian is Raphael's Transfiguration, the way it sits with no frame at all in the culminating room of the Pinacotheca of the Vatican, and back to the Titian. Let's look more closely at it. Every part of it, of course, is a masterpiece, and as a whole, undoubtedly, there are any number of relationships between figures, both compositionally, gesturally, and also in terms of eye contact. This guy is definitely inspired by Michelangelo's God, although very personal to Titian. A whole chorus of little putti, or cherubs in this context. They're all occupying the same story, unlike the Raphael, which is actually two stories. And this I introduce because I've made this point before. Pay attention to how the composition is related to the frame. In other words, if you just look at the composition internally and miss these elements, you're not actually paying attention to the composition as a whole. Right? You see how these parts are parts of the composition, right? You have to, the frame is contemporary with the painting. So if you take away these high altars and all you look at is a canvas in a rectangle on a wall, you're not reading the work of art as a whole. Good example. Okay, so who was directly influenced in a huge way by this painting? It was none other than El Greco. El Greco El Greco is actually a Venetian painter. Crete, where he is from, was a part of one of the richest provinces of the Venetian Empire. El Greco, once he finished his youthful studies, went to Venice, spent a few years in Venice in Titian's last few years, then went on to Rome for a number of years, and this is his first great masterpiece in Spain for the high altar of a church in Seville. And sadly, it no longer commands that altar. Instead, you have it hanging on a wall in Chicago. So, context is a big part. Another altarpiece by Titian, just after he painted the great Assumption. This is a painting which is directly inspired by Raphael, although very much in Titian's manner. And this is a manner that Titian will abandon shortly after this set of masterpieces. And so in the later 1530s, he will move into another stylistic realm, which we will pick up next week. But we are really on not just the threshold, but we're already in the beginning of the Baroque here in this set of paintings by Titian. The extreme rotating bodies, contrapposto, the dynamism between the bodies is something that he shares directly with Michelangelo, and especially the painted figures in the Sistine ceiling, although the exact dynamics between him and Michelangelo I'm unaware of. And a much more sedate version, but still incorporating this new manner, is also in the Church of the Friars, the so-called Pesaro altarpiece, again showing it in its immediate and larger context. And its altar, it was under restoration for a long time. It's just recently been but back there you see it. So shortly after he finished this, he received the commission for the Pesaro altarpiece. And this is not just the beginning of the Baroque, it's also the beginning of another great artist of the final phase of Venetian art, Tiepolo. Very much emerges out of this painting as well. And we'll see, like specifically, this figure is going to be revisited in another context, a pagan context, now in Vicenza. So that'll be my last lecture. And here are the donors. It celebrates a major naval victory in Florence over the Turks. Let's see, you have this turban fellow, and the flag is the emblem of victory. But as you can see, it's all in compressed space, even though at this extreme angle. And it's the beginning of a new form of composition that in the 18th century, try it again, was called the scena per angolo in Italian, the composition at an angle. And two of the masters of that will be Uvara, his stage compositions, and also the Bibienas in the early 18th century. So here we see it in its setting. So when you have these columns, do remember the frame. They don't exist independent of all the rest. Another high altar. We're coming close to the end. So this one in the more triptych manner, a resurrection. It's called the Averoldi polyptych, multiple ptychs, and it has, there you see a really horrible over yellow image in its current setting, which is from the 18th century, but it was designed to be the culminating image in a church. And here you see it in its 18th century form. And it has this extraordinary Annunciation, the angel announcing through writing the scroll that he unveils on the left-hand side of the painting, and the Madonna with her book stand just hinted at over here, receiving the message. And across them is the image of the resurrection. We're on the threshold of Titian's later style. Not quite, but close, and back in the context. The patron is squished into this corner here. And it's only in that context that we're now in 1520. The famous entombment in the Louvre is painted, and we are on the threshold of a new stylistic manner, which, although clearly coming out of the trajectory of Bellini and Giorgione, is going to be very much Titian's signature style in its previous setting in the Louvre. And just to remind you, low relief is the fundamental horizon out of which all this comes. And literally, this is what the Renaissance artists were studying to overcome the pitfalls and charms of perspectival realism. This is the body of Hector being carried back into the city. And this is another myth, the death of the Greek hero Melanger. And clearly, Titian is channeling this. This is a somewhat better reproduction, a little too dark, but capturing more of the mood of this extraordinary composition. We had a class on it a couple of weeks ago. And just to set the framework, when we see a relief like this relief from the Late 5th century from Eleusis. This is the Roman copy that is present in the Metropolitan. We should remember that this is contemporary with Greek monumental painting. So when we look at this relief, this gives us some insight into Greek monumental painting from the same period, pretty much all of which has vanished except for echoes in Roman wall painting in Pompeii and Herculaneum and a few other places. So that is within that artistic horizon. And in many ways, a return to the Greeks in the 5th century BC, not just in narrative, not just in subject matter, but also in form. And that could be a whole other course. So, these paintings are contemporary with the great Assumption, and it shows the range of Titian's oeuvre at this point in his early maturity. Had he died at this point, he would still be one of the great painters of European painting, but he didn't. He lived for another 40 years and continued to paint. At the end of this period is sadly a lost painting. It's known from a careful copy from the 18th century. It's called The Death of St. Peter Martyr, from the Basilica of San Giovanni in Paolo. The original painting was destroyed in a fire in 1867, which destroyed a number of Titians and Bellinis, and so we only know it from this copy. And it's again one of these spiraling three-dimensional vertical compositions that will very much be the starting point for Piazzetta and Tiepolo in the 18th century. And then finally, a Madonna and Child and St. John and a nurse. We don't know who the figure kneeling is. It's just called the Virgin and Child with the infant St. John and a female saint or donor. Okay, so it's then that this painting is painted, and this is our threshold painting between the early maturity of Titian and his late maturity, and it's one of his final vertical compositions is from 1535 now, the Madonna of the Frari, of the Friars again. This one lives in the Vatican. He's, well, you can see what's happened to the more recognizable architectural syntax of the composition. It's really all about the figures in an extremely compressed, very moody atmosphere. A brilliant composition. I think this is a parapet, so it's a ruin above which this vision of the Madonna and Child is being manifest. So that was the beginning of this trajectory, way back in the around 1470, with Bellini, a uniquely Venetian trajectory. And in many ways, the seeds of everything we've seen is already present, although in an infinitely more quiet way in this Bellini. These two images are there to remind you that there were many other painters in Venice at the time. This is the St. Barbara polyptych by Palma il Vecchio from around 1523, very much in the diptych manner, although now in these extraordinary architectural frames. And another painting by Palma Vecchio. And so in the second rank of painters, although this is one of his best paintings, so definitely a very fine painting, you can see the specific Venetian streams coming together in a very Venetian style. So there are echoes of the Flemish. There are very much present the achievements of the High Renaissance, but there is very much in the foreground a distinctly iconic, which is to say East Roman Byzantine tradition as well. All of these creating images of extreme focus and contemplative character, and always pushing the figures into the very, very shallow foreground, which, after all, is what the whole Eastern um, tradition is all about. And here we have a map of Venice from about 1530 at the end of this period. So, to be continued. You can ask me questions if not everything is self-evident. Yes.
When Giorgione tries to be more, he tries to give more perspective laws. Aren't certain parts of the viewing still compressed?
Oh, yeah, they are still compressed. But what he's doing is he's responding to what has been going on in Florence, mainly. The culminating image and culminating masterpiece failure of perspectival realism is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And that's what I talk about in lecture number 3 in the Michelangelo series. And I contrast that with the successful response to that, which is Del Sarto's Last Supper in that convent in Florence, where he deals well. He engages in the sleight of hand, which becomes the tradition basically from the early 15th century until the 19th century. So you have multiple vanishing points, you have compressed space, but it's all arranged in such a way that at a glance you have the illusion of actual perspectival realism that is operating formally very much in the manner of an Escher, which is to say, it's all about multiple points of view because we do not take the visual world in at a glance. We're not a camera or one of these digital things that have replaced cameras. Our eye wanders across the pictorial field and constructs the image in motion. And so necessarily it's a series of stills that is a composite. And it's very dynamic. That is where the success of film comes from, because when people who began to make films early in the 20th century realized the possibility of the film actually experientially recreating the way our eye wanders around the visual world, that's a part of the power and realism of film. And it's, another prosaic way of putting it, it's in the editing. But in a painting, it's the way a painter choreographs the motion of your eye across the pictorial field.
So a lot of it has to do with the way the narrative is portrayed.
Yes, through what are the tools of the painter? Composition, color, form, and the figures. In as much as they recognize figures that we recognize, gesture, glance, posture, all of that is how the viewer's eye is choreographed through the pictorial field. And if the pictorial field is dominated by a void that vanishes at one point, all the other elements of the field tend to be subordinate to that emptiness. And that's exactly the problem with Leonardo Last Supper. That huge room, even though he squeezes it and makes it as small as he can and pushes the figures, the apostles and Christ, on a ledge, because he's wedded to this new discovery of the early 14th century, you have distractions like all those feet underneath the tablecloth, right? I mean, you don't really see that anymore because the painting is so damaged. But if you look at good reproductions, copies made of the painting when it was relatively fresh and just slowly decaying, you can see it's very distracting. And then just the void of the room behind it is another huge distraction. But where Leonardo's painting works best is if you read it as a frieze in relief, and that's where the genius of the relationship between the apostles and Christ and their gestures and their characterization resides. And okay, to be continued.